Okay, so we'll go ahead and do the roll call. Again, this is just to note if we do happen to have a quorum in any particular subbasin committee, we're not going to take any action today, but it is just part of our record. Okay, Mesquita. Barrientos. Bun.
Here.
Shaban. Chapin Hodges.
Here.
Clark. Francione.
Here.
Granillo. Lee.
Here.
Herrera.
Here.
Framers. Orr. McIntyre.
Here.
Nunes. Panzera Allen. Panzera Ron.
Here. That was Alan.
Oh, great. Okay. Rice. Smith. Adcock. Esfahanian.
Yes.
Malone. Bean. Breen.
Here.
Brennan.
Here.
Coppernow. Hardgrave. Stefani. Jakes. Bailey. Bloom.
Here.
Oh, gotcha. Bloom. I see you, Bloom. Crank. I saw you as well, Jeffrey Crank. Kramers. Light.
Here.
Matoso. Okay. So now we need to on items on the agenda.
Emily, you have one attendee with a raised hand. I don't know if it was someone whose name you called and did not respond.
Okay. Okay, you should be able to talk. Phone number ending in 0312. Okay, so the person with the phone number ending in 0312, I am asking you to unmute. And so I think you should be able to unmute yourself and speak. Okay. Oh, there you are.
Oh, it's Coppernow here.
Okay, great. Have you down, thank you. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so now going to any public comments on items on the agenda. We have any public comments? Okay, don't see any hands raised. And so now we will go on to our scheduled item, which is a water law presentation from Valerie Kincaid. She's a partner with O'Loughlin in Paris. She's presented to our board of directors, it was a year or two ago, on more of a broader Sigma and water right presentation, and now we're going to be diving a little bit more into the weeds as we're working through our GSP development. She's going to to give us some of the background on water rights and some of the major issues that we need to consider going forward. So thank you for joining us today, Valerie. And please
Sure,
take it
thank
away.
you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. With that, I will go ahead and start. Derek, do you need to say anything else for intros or no?
No, I think you're doing fine. Valerie is the attorney who is on our team here and has been helping us with a number of GSPs and is working on them throughout the state. But please go ahead, Valerie.
Sure. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of water rights in California. We're going to start with surface water rights and then move to groundwater rights. I apologize if it looks like I'm looking down a lot. I have my phone as a camera, but I'm going to be looking at the presentation along with you on my computer. Emily, if there are questions throughout the presentation, I'm happy to take them.
Okay.
But you can just stop me anytime you wish. There are about 29 slides. And like I said, it's a lot of information on each slide, so feel free to stop me where you want more info or to drill down with questions. So with that, we will start. This is the agenda. Like I said, we're going to talk about surface water rights, the numerous kinds, and then frankly more on groundwater rights, and what is included in those, and what a right allows you to do, and different components of those rights, and what happens when there are shortages throughout the system, which is a pretty important issue. So water rights generally, in the legal community, a water right is a property right, but it is not what we call a possessory right. It's what attorneys call a usufructuary right, which is an interesting word, but it basically means that you have a right to divert or extract water so long as it's available. You do not have a right to extract or divert water if it's not available. So the right is not possessing a molecule of water. It is, think of it like an option. When water is available, you have a right to divert that and use water. And you can take it and use it. You can never waste it. There is no right to use water in an unreasonable or wasteful manner. And that is true for surface water or groundwater. And it's in the California Constitution. So it's kind of an overriding principle of water rights law. So that's a little bit of a background before we really unpack all of the rules. But just remember that when there's not available supply, you don't have a right to demand water unless it's available when it's your turn. Okay, so we're going to now talk about when it's your turn quite a bit. All right, so surface water rights in California, there are three main types of surface water rights: Pueblo rights, riparian rights, and appropriative rights. Pueblo rights are based on a secession of Spanish settlement. Most Pueblo rights are frankly already settled. The city of LA is probably the biggest Pueblo water right holder. Think of a pre-US Spanish settlement. If that kind of precursor to the municipality was using water, then that is what the basis of a Pueblo right. We're not going to focus on that because, like I said, most of the arguments about Pueblo rights have already been established, and that's a little bit from a water practitioner perspective in our rearview mirror. Riparian rights, which are based on land ownership, and appropriative rights, which are based on water use, are still rights that we very much fight about and continue to try to develop. Sorry, I'm going kind of fast there. There we go. So I'm going to start with riparian rights, and you have three categories here, and it really kind of breaks down the rights. The first is requirements, and that's what you need to do to establish a riparian right. The second category is benefits. That means what you can do with the right. And the third category is restrictions, what you can't do with the right. And the riparian right and the appropriative rights, the post-14 and pre-14 riparian rights, they all have different requirements, benefits, and restrictions. So we'll go through those fairly quickly. So in order to have a riparian right, you must own a piece of land that's contiguous to a natural watercourse. Okay, so it can't be a canal, and that's a man-made watercourse, and riparian rights don't attach. You can, it has to be the smallest parcel in a single chain of title. And what that means is if you originally had a huge piece of property that was contiguous to a watercourse, and it has since been cut up and made smaller and smaller. The riparian right only applies to the very smallest piece of land that remains contiguous. Water must be used within the watershed. So if you have that huge piece of land and some of it is outside the watershed, the riparian right does not attach to the lands that are outside the watershed. There is no application or permitting for riparian rights. It just is a right that goes with the land, and you cannot separate a riparian right from the land. Interestingly, that last bullet on requirements is specifically important because it means the State Water Board does not have jurisdiction over riparian rights. They can't regulate them. Other than unreasonable use, they can't stop you from using a riparian right. It's literally a right that the State Water Board has not given and has no regulatory authority over. So the benefits of a riparian right are pretty great. There's no quantification of the right, which means there's no real limitation. You still can't use water unreasonably, but if you want to plant a very a crop that has a very high water demand, you can do that and use as much water as is necessary on that riparian parcel, and there's no specific limit. So there you can use as much water, again, as you can put to use on your riparian parcel. There's no forfeiture from non-use. That means that if you have a riparian parcel and you want to sell it and no one has used water on that riparian parcel for 100 years, if you sell it to someone else, they can start using water right away, and there's no forfeiture issue when it comes to riparians. Like I said before, it runs with the land, and that means that you cannot sell a riparian right off the land. It is literally tied with it. So the minute that that parcel that's contiguous to a watercourse moves, the riparian right moves with it. You can't move it off. So on to restrictions, there are a lot of restrictions with riparian water rights. You can only divert and put water to beneficial use that's natural flow. That means that you cannot divert water that was previously stored by someone else and is now coming down a watercourse. You have no right to that. So that's a big issue in the Delta, probably not as big of an issue maybe where you guys are, but when you have stored water in Shasta and there are Delta riparians, if folks are releasing stored water, no riparians can divert that stored water because it's not natural flow. There's no storage right for a riparian water right user. You cannot store water and use it for later. You can only take the water that's coming by your property in a natural flow and divert that. There's no diversion of imported foreign or return flows. So any flow that's, again, non-natural, you don't have a right to that. And again, it's limited to the riparian parcel. If you have two parcels that are side by side, one's riparian and one's not, you cannot take the riparian right and apply that riparian water to the parcel that's non-riparian. So it is a pretty big limitation. There's no transferring, there's not trading. It's a fairly limited right to that contiguous parcel. All right, so that's the basics of our riparian rights. There are two different kinds of appropriative surface water rights. The first is pre-14 and the second is post-14. And the reason for that division, of course, is that the Water Commission, which is the precursor to the State Water Resources Control Board, came on in 1914 and instituted a required method of getting licensed appropriative water rights. So if you have an appropriative pre-14 right, similar to your riparian right, the State Water Board did not issue that right and has no regulatory authority over it. The way that you can establish a pre-14 right is that you had the intent to divert water prior to 1914. Now, people immediately always ask when we're talking about pre-14 rights, what does that mean? And it's really an evidentiary issue. Can you prove that you were either diverting water prior to 1914? Do you have cropping records? Did you have canals in place at that time? Do you have records of either cropping or water diversion on your piece of land prior to 1914? Usually the intent to divert is if you're putting in a large system or if a municipality has a plan. For example, if you had a plan to build a large water infrastructure, canals, and that kind of thing to supply a municipality in 1913, that would be very good evidence of a pre-14 rate. Of course, as we are going further and further away from 1914, it becomes more and more difficult to establish a pre-14 rate, because the folks who used to use water then are no longer around. And frankly, the amount of records and other evidentiary proof are becoming less and less available. So you have to also put water to actual use, and you have to be diligent in putting that water to use. And what that means is, if you had a plan in 1913 to build out infrastructure, if you're not diligent and putting that water to actual use, if it takes you, let's say, 50 years and you don't actually use water until 1960, it's going to be difficult to establish that you have a pre-14 rate. So that's what those actual use and diligent to putting water to use mean in those components. The benefits of having a pre-14 right are fairly large. You can transfer water. Unlike a riparian, you can move that pre-14 water off the parcel. You can store water so long as you stored water prior to 1914. And these rights are senior to the 1914 rights. Now, they're not unlimited like riparian rights. They have a specific quantity, point of diversion, place of use, and those are not necessarily written down unless you have a court that has adjudicated that pre-14 right. Those are all based on the characteristics of use of water prior to 1914. So if you have data or evidence that says you used 100 acre feet in 1913, that is your defined quantity that you can use. If you want to use 1,000 acre feet now under a pre-14 right, but you only have evidence that you used 100 prior to 1914, you're going to have a hard time. So again, it's not written down unless it's adjudicated, but all of the components of a pre-14 right are based on use, that use prior to 1914. So the restrictions are, there's a defined quantity. Again, you can only use as much as you put to beneficial use prior to 1914. There is a defined season, place of use, point of diversion. There is a forfeiture issue. So if you have a pre-14 right and you say, from 1913 to 1920, we used 1,000 acre feet all the time. We have great records that show that. But then you have a 5 or 10 year or any more than 5 year period where someone can prove non-use for that 5 year period, a pre-14 right is subject to forfeiture. And also one of the really difficult things about a pre-14 right is really it's a claim until it's adjudicated. So there are several adjudicated pre-14 rights, meaning people have gone and fought about whether their claim to having a pre-14 exists. For example, on the Stanislaus River, they have an adjudication that defines the quantity, and that's a court that comes in and says, yep, you guys used water prior to 1914, and here's how much you used, and here's the constructs of that right. But interestingly, there are many, many more claims that are non-adjudicated pre-14 rights. For example, in the Delta, every year there's about 2,500 claims to statements of diversion and use claiming a riparian right, a pre-14 right. And those are claims. Until they're adjudicated by a court, they are not a verified water right. They are a claim to hold a pre-14 right. So obviously that can be very difficult if you want to sell or transfer that right. If it's a great claim that is supported by evidence, that might work. But if it's not, you could run into some issues. All right, so moving on to post-14 rights. Again, these are both appropriative rights. Post-14 rights are different because the State Water Board issues these rights. And anytime you want to use water newly after 1914, the requirements are that you have to go to the State Water Resources Control Board. You have to provide an application, fill out an application. The State Water Board then does a water availability analysis. They have to decide that water is available for appropriation. If they decide that it is, then they will issue you a permit. And in that time, you have to diligently put the water that is in the permit to use. And after you do put that water to beneficial use, the State Water Resources Control Board will then usually issue a license. And that is a post-14 appropriative right, is that water right license. The benefits of having a post-14 license are that there are definitely defined attributes of the right. So you now have a piece of paper that says how much water you can divert, the season of use, the place of use, the point of diversion. All of the attributes of that right are written down and locked in through that license. You may store water under a post-14 right. You can apply for the right to divert water to storage. That is something that the Water Board may consider and give you. And of course, you may change, transfer, or sell this water. So it's a much more dynamic right. If you want to move water off your property, you probably are better off with an appropriative right than a riparian right, because that's a restriction. Restrictions are kind of the flip of the benefits, frankly, is that you have a defined quantity. So you can't go over that quantity. If you have a water right for 100 acre feet and you want to use 120, you have to reapply and go through the whole process to use that extra 20. You can't amend it or kind of finagle or change at least the quantity. There's defined season of use, place of use, point of diversion. You can change those, but as that last bullet indicates, a change of any of the components of those besides quantity will require a change petition that has to be approved by the State Water Resources Control Board. So in years past, maybe 20 years ago, that was less difficult than it is today. Doing a change petition today, especially for a transfer, is a longer process that involves CEQA, and it's more difficult and less dynamic than changes. If you have a pre-14 right, you can make those changes without asking the board. So that's a major difference between pre and post 1914 appropriative rights. Very similar to the pre-14 right, the post-14 right is subject to forfeiture. You have to use it or lose it. So those are the rules for the appropriative surface water rights. Okay, so when there is shortage in the surface water system, this is a pretty high level and basic rules here, but when there's not enough supply to meet demand, each category of right is reduced before any reduction to the next category of priority is taken. And what I mean by that is all Pueblo water right holders are made entirely whole. They get 100% of their supply before riparians are shorted. And similarly, riparians get 100% of their supply before you can start supplying any water to an appropriative water right holder. That makes, frankly, the practice of having riparian claims very difficult. So the question becomes for the State Water Resources Control Board during shortage and curtailment, do you have to satisfy all of the riparian claims, even if they're not verified, before you provide any water to appropriators? And so far the answer is yes, that's what you have to do. And then when you get to shortage amongst and between riparians, for example, if there's enough supply to meet all Pueblo water rights, but not enough supply to provide for all riparians, shortage amongst and between riparians is governed by what's called the correlative doctrine, and it comes from co-relative, and it basically means you just have a pro rata shortage. So for example, if there was enough supply to meet 80% of the riparian demand, all riparians would have a 20% shortage for that year. So they kind of take across the board pro rata shortages. If there is enough supply to meet all riparians and some appropriators, but not all appropriators are reduced based on first in time, first in right. So that means the earliest pre-14 appropriative water right holders get 100% of their supply before the next person in line. And again, in practice, this is very difficult because of course we don't have everyone necessarily in line and recognized. And so it's very difficult to have the State Water Resources Control Board manage shortage. A lot of times they will cut people off at a certain date But of course, that date is an estimate, and it's a difficult thing to do. But that is how shortage is allotted in surface water. It's by category first, and then in that category, there are different rules. So for riparians, it's kind of pro rata, correlative reductions. And for appropriators, it's simply date of priority. So everyone has to line up and get in line. And if the water stops right before your date of priority, then you're cut off. All right. Okay, so that is a pretty high level, fast summary of kind of the rules of surface water supplies and surface water rights and how supply is allocated if there's a shortage. I'm going to move on to groundwater now, and of course there are two different systems in California. There's the surface water right system and the groundwater right system. And so I'll move on unless there are questions. I'll kind of pause here to see if there are any questions about the surface water rules as they apply to reality. All right, well, if there are no questions, I assume this is all crystal clear, and I'll continue.
I just had a question, Valerie. This is Bill
Sure.
White. What's considered waste? When you were talking about, you know, you don't have the right to the actual droplets of water. You have the right to use them in a beneficial way.
Right.
And I'm just curious because there's lots of people making some claims around here about what's beneficial and what's wasteful. And I'm just wondering if there's a concrete definition of what that is. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that has been pondered by a lot of the courts. Unfortunately, it is supposed to be a case-by-case basis. So there is no, this is absolutely waste and this is perfectly fine. It is an evolving practice. Some of the early waste cases were that people were diverting the entire San Joaquin River in order to get water kind of over to water their cow pasture. And that early case, which was called Herminghaus, decided that because of facilities issue, you can't use all the water and dry out every single person just because you need to get water to a specific spot. So that was considered waste and unreasonable use. You could build a pipeline, or you could kind of get the water over there in a less wasteful manner. But it is a case-by-case issue. So there are a lot of trends, and people are very, very nervous that soon certain types of crops will be determined wasteful because they're not a great use of water in today's world. So far, the courts haven't gone that far. And usually you look at whether you've got, you know, a huge leaky system. For example, if you had 30 or 40% of your system is waste and it's leaking and sloshing water around, that could potentially be, a waste, especially if that water is not recharging or if it's evaporating and just, not being used for another beneficial use. But it is a case-by-case basis, and it's an evolving issue. There are some, the State Water Board has begun to realize it's a very good tool for them, and they're beginning to regulate based on the waste and unreasonable use doctrine. People continue to fight about that. But unfortunately, the answer really is that it should be case by case, and there's no hard and fast rules that if your crop uses, X amount of water, it's wasteful. That does not exist right now. And it's hard because, frankly, you would have to bring a waste case. And maybe if you had a huge water user that was really, really wasteful, that would work out. But if it's kind of a single cropping person, bringing that waste case and getting them to stop using water based on that, bringing a whole bunch of evidence in and having an actual trial about the waste and their use of water is not easy or cheap in today's world. So it's tough.
Great.
Valerie,
Great. And there's another question from Steve, but I just wanted to interrupt and just say that we do have a quorum in all 5 sub-basin planning committees, just for our record. And thank you all for your attendance, and just needed to note that for the record. So please continue with your question, Steve.
Thank you, Emily. Valerie, I'm curious on natural flow versus surplus flows. How is that, from a practical standpoint, determined, and who determines that? The state, or is that done on a local level?
Also a good question. So in the Delta, where this is a really big issue, it is the state water project contractors and other folks who are storing water. So at some point, everyone looks at the system and says, you know, the natural flows are no longer really in the system, and we've now moved to all water flowing down from Shasta or Oroville being stored water. And usually that's called a term 91 for the Delta anyway. And what that means is everyone who's a riparian has to stop diverting water. So the State Water Resources Control Board will send out a term 91 notice and say, okay, natural flows are gone. Now all the water in the system is stored water. So unless you have a right to that stored water, your time to divert lawfully is gone. Now there are other side systems, and of course that's kind of a generalization for the big macro system coming from the Sac Valley into the Delta. They have a similar term 93 on the San Joaquin River, where natural flows stop, and again, stored water is the only thing left. But when we went through the curtailment of 2014 and 2015, what you saw were that those macro decisions didn't really apply to necessarily like a side tributary. And a lot of people defended their continued diversions even after receiving curtailment notices saying you have no more water for your right. A lot of people said, but I know I do. There's a tributary coming next to my property and there's no upstream stored water supply. So if water's coming, it's natural flow and I can still keep diverting. So in a perfect world, it would be very, very localized. And I think at some point, as people keep tightening our water belt, it will become more localized. But generally, folks who are in the operations part of the water system tell you when surface water and natural flows stop and stored water begins. So there are notices, people are usually noticed.
Well, I appreciate that. I just find it interesting that some of the water certainly that is stored would have been considered natural flow had it not been dammed on a river. So
that's right.
Interesting, but I'm sure that's into the weeds.
No, it is, and it's the question then becomes, should the water board have issued a license to divert water to storage? Right? Was water available? Remember that when we first started talking about a post-14 right, they have to do a water availability analysis. Well, did they do it right? Should they have let those people divert water to storage? Because once you divert water to storage, when I first started talking about a possessory right and a usufructuary right, when you put that water into storage, it becomes possessory. So when I take that water out of a natural system and put it into storage, it changes. Now it's no longer if I have it right. I have already taken it. I diverted it out of the system, appropriated it out of the system, and I put it in a storage facility based on a right that I have. And now I do own that molecule. That molecule's mine. It's not an option, right? I just took it. So it is pretty important when you put water in storage. It does change from a legal perspective the component of that water. It's no longer an option. You now own it. It's yours. You own that molecule.
Great, thank you.
Valerie, where does environmental flows fall into all this?
Yeah, well, that's the literally billion-dollar question. So the State Water Resources Control Board has authority to change your license, right? So they issue you a license. They can do a public trust hearing, or they can do a water quality control plan and say, a certain percent of the water that you are now diverting has to stay in stream. So that's another issue with this, non-possessory right, is that the water board can go in and put conditions on your water right that requires you to leave water in stream. They are doing that. I think most people know this. They've kind of phased the water quality control plan from the San Joaquin and the Sacramento rivers, and they're in the middle of doing that right now. Currently, phase 1 from the San Joaquin is passed, and that would require 40% of the unimpaired flow. So 40% of the natural flow would have to stay in the San Joaquin River and its tributaries. So that's the proposed regulation. Everyone is suing on it. It's being litigated. But certainly the interesting part is that fish and environmental components cannot hold a water right. So you can't go and apply for a fish beneficial use. You can keep water if you have a right to divert water. You can say, I'm going to actually leave it in the system, and that's called a 1707. But you do this thing called a 1707, and you say, even though I could divert it, I'm going to leave it in for fishery benefits. You can do that and protect it. And like I said, the state water board can pull back your license to make you leave water in stream. But what does that mean for, riparians and pre-14s? The state water board has a limited ability to really get to those water right holders. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'll move on and we'll start talking more about groundwater and extractions rather than diversions. So percolating, I'm going to talk the first, I think, 2 slides. Is that right? Yeah. The first 2 slides are really talking about groundwater and what that is, what that means. So groundwater is percolating groundwater is largely considered water that is not in known and definite channels. So that's water that's kind of in the bedrock, down in large kind of pool areas, but it is not in a bed and bank and known defined channels. So that is the definition of percolating groundwater. If water is below ground and you do not prove that it is in known and defined channels, it is assumed to be percolating groundwater. So the assumption is if it's underground, it's percolating groundwater, which means groundwater. That's how we're going to talk about it from here on out. The flip side of that is if you can prove that there is water underground flowing in known and defined channels, then that isn't groundwater. It's kind of what some people call subsurface flow, but in the legal world, it's treated as surface water. So if we're talking about groundwater, we're talking about things that are not in known and defined subsurface channels. We're not talking about subsurface flows. If there's a subsurface flow, you're talking about the rules for surface water rates. If it's percolating groundwater, we're talking about the rules for groundwater rates. They're 2 different systems that rarely interface. So, okay. So for groundwater rights, there are 4 types of groundwater rights: Pueblo, overlying, appropriative, and prescriptive. Some of these have very similar attributes in the surface water world. It's cut off a little bit by the picture, but remember that, again, not only we're talking about percolating groundwater, but when we're talking about groundwater, we are talking about common supply, okay? Native common supply. We're not talking about water that's recharged or banked. We're not talking about imported water and water that already has an ownership component and put in the ground. And that, I think, is going to become increasingly important in the groundwater rights world. I think given Sigma and just the general demand and supply issues that we're all having and the need to come up with recharge projects, it's something that people are going to dramatically change. Previously, a lot of common groundwater was made up of abandoned applied surface water. And those are legal terms, but operationally what that means is people used to put water, surface water, on crops, and then then they didn't care about the water that percolated below the root zone. That was just sort of an abandoned water that became common supply. So that was, recharged water really wasn't accounted for, I think, historically. Some people did. There's a couple cases in LA where that are the foundation of kind of the groundwater rights laws that we have today, where people didn't just abandon that, and the water moved downstream and they picked it up and claimed it. But keep in mind that as we move from into groundwater regulation, I think more and more people are going to be more cognizant about this abandoned issue. People are going to begin making claims on water and taking it out of the common supply bucket. But when we talk about the right to extract groundwater, we're really talking about the right to extract from that common supply bucket. Again, groundwater extractions are limited to reasonable use. You can't use water unreasonably. Even if it's groundwater, you can't waste it. So that similar constitutional provision of unreasonable use applies to groundwater as well. All right, so Pueblo rights, again, very similar to the Pueblo rights in the surface water system. They come from a local city or local government that's a successor of a Spanish or Mexican land grant. Again, most Pueblo rights have been fought over and adjudicated, and most of those are settled. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the Pueblo right. It is the highest priority of right. It is very difficult to establish. I'm not sure we'll see any new claims to Pueblo rights today. It'd be very difficult to establish that there was a secret Spanish or Mexican municipality that didn't come out and already establish a Pueblo right. So overlying rights. So most groundwater rights are overlying water rights. And like the riparian right, an overlying water right is based on land ownership. So if you own a piece of land that overlies percolating groundwater, it allows that landowner to extract groundwater and use it on the overlying parcel. Very similar to riparian rights. You cannot transfer overlying water rights. You cannot move it off the overlying land. You can have, if you have a huge amount of overlying water, you can use one pump to serve several parcels. But again, it has to come from kind of the same basic common supply. An overlying water right is not quantified, very similar again to a riparian right. It does allow the water right holder to extract water and use as much as they can beneficially use on that overlying parcel. So again, it's similar, most similar to a riparian right from the surface water system we talked about earlier. Overlying water rights cannot be used for municipal rights. So municipal and public extractions for public water systems are by definition not overlying water rights. They are appropriative water rights. And that it doesn't matter. You cannot kind of combine all overlying water right holders in a municipality and say, but we're all overlying water right holders, and that should allow the municipality to use that overlying right to serve us. It simply is kind of mutually exclusive. If you have a municipal supply, it is an appropriative supply or a prescriptive supply. Okay, so appropriative water rights in groundwater is probably most similar to the pre-14 water right for surface water holders. Again, it's based on the actual taking of water and use of water. So if you're an overlying water right holder and you use more water than is beneficially needed on your property, that begins an appropriative water right. Or if you're using water and transferring it to a non-overlying parcel, again, that would be an appropriative water right. You can export water, groundwater, after you've extracted it. Obviously, there are a huge number of new ordinances from counties and cities and even GSAs that limit that. So we're talking about a common law right here. I'm not saying that you can always export water. I'm just saying if you have an appropriative water right without another limitation, it would allow you to export groundwater to a non-overlying parcel. Municipal appropriation, like I said previously, those are all appropriative rights. And the quantity of an appropriative right is, of course, based on the amount of water extracted and put to use. Very similar to the pre-14 right, it's based on water used. There is no system, and SGMA does not institute a system of permitting. So the Water Resources Control Board does not ever give you a license or a piece of paper to extract and use groundwater. Any claim to have an appropriative groundwater right is, of course, based on prior and previous use. All right. So prescriptive rights. This is where groundwater really departs from the surface water system. I think up until the prescriptive issue, you can prescribe surface water rights as well, but it's not as common. And it's not as common, I think, for a pretty practical reason, which is that you can actually see it, and it's more obvious if someone's using water or putting a siphon on across your property to a surface water system. It's much more discreet to sink a well on your own property and be pumping water beyond your right, which is what gives rise to a prescriptive right. So prescriptive right develops when an appropriator takes water that is not surplus. So you have to be an overdraft in order to begin a prescriptive right. And the prescriptive use has to be open, actual, and notorious, so people have to see and be aware of it. It has to be hostile and adverse to true owners, meaning you have to actually be taking someone else's water. You have to be shorting them or putting the basin into overdraft. It has to be under a claim of right. You can't say that you're borrowing it or that you didn't mean to establish a right. And it has to be a continued uninterrupted use for 5 years. So both overlying and appropriate rights are subject to prescription. Prescription is, I think, an interesting concept. I know probably other people like prescription more than I do. I tend to think it's rewarding people who are taking water that's not theirs, which is it's an interesting component of the law. The only way I can kind of explain this for folks saying, why would we ever have that component, is that you know, you do want water to be put to beneficial use all the time. So historically, if people aren't using their water and someone else is willing to step in and use it and put it to good beneficial use, the concept would be that that would be rewarded, and they could establish a right through doing that. I think in today's world, prescriptive rights are tough. They basically have to come in a series of overdraft and start taking water and edge someone else's use of that water out. So it literally is a taking of someone else's right. All right, so again, prescriptive rights cannot start when there is surplus. So if there is sufficient groundwater for everyone to divert their overlying water right fulfilled and all appropriative rights, and you start using water, you're not a prescriptive user. You are simply an appropriator, right? So if you start putting water to use tomorrow and there's plenty of supply, then tomorrow is your date of priority for your appropriative right, and you're an appropriative water right holder. If you start taking in a time that there is no surplus, meaning there's no water available, and you're taking during a shortage, then if you start using water open notoriously for 5 years, you could potentially be prescribing someone else's right. Okay, so that's the difference between prescriptive right and appropriative right. One is during surplus and one is not. There are some restrictions. Interestingly, private pumpers cannot prescribe against public entities and municipalities. So those folks are safe, usually from prescription. Prescription is hard to establish. A lot of times you'll have to go and have a long, drawn out court battle. And when systems are in overdraft and over prescribed, there's usually a huge amount of evidence you have to put on that folks have this continued 5-year period of use. And then, of course, you can stop a potential prescriptor by continuing to extract water. So that's called self-help in the law. And if a whole basin went in and tried to figure out and was in an adjudication and folks were claiming prescription, the one way a valid overlying water right holder or appropriator could defend their right would be to prove that they did the self-help. And what that means is that they continued to take the same and extract and use the same amount of water. And that defense is telling the court that the prescriber, the person doing the prescribing or the prescriptive use, didn't actually keep them from using their water. So it's not adverse. So that's one of the components of a prescription, is it has to be adverse. It has to keep someone else from taking their water. So if you can prove that you continued to pump, that's called self-help, and you should be able to protect your right. And I think from everyone's perspective, you know, if you look at this, it's obvious that that kind of is this, people call it the tragedy of the commons. If you've got a prescriber and you need to do self-help, then everyone's basically just pumping, over pumping and overdraft systems. So that it does get you into trouble and oftentimes in overdraft. All right, so Sigma saw that issue, this kind of tragedy of the commons, and how everyone was going to just continue to pump. And even if you didn't need to pump, maybe you would have to engage in self-help pumping to protect your right. And they did say, okay, we're going to have a stop here. We're going to stop, and that any prescriptive claims and any extractions supporting a prescriptive claim between January 15th and a plan is adopted would stop. So Sigma did kind of put a hold on prescriptive claims in a regulatory capacity. All right. So what happens to each of these rights during shortage and overdraft and non-use? We're going to focus mostly on shortage and non-use. Like I said, the overdraft component really only applies when we're talking about prescription. Okay, so similar to the surface water system, extractions are limited in order of priority category. So again, the Pueblo groundwater extractors get to take their entire 100% demand before any overlying water right holders are supplied. And similarly, 100% of the overlying demand has to be met before any appropriator can begin to take. And so that's the category. Within each category, similar to the riparians and the correlative issue, the overlying water right holders do the same thing. During times of shortage, they're senior, but amongst and between each other, you have to be apportioned to their proportionate fair share. And usually that means some sort of pro rata share. But there are a history of cases that talk about kind of going back to the earlier question of what really is waste and what is not. If you have a water right holder who's, or a groundwater extractor who, because of a system, is having to use twice as much water as their neighbor to support the same crop, a correlative and proportionate fair share reduction during times of shortage, a court will consider those factual issues. So this is kind of what I'm saying. There's no specific formula. I think generally courts say, you know, if there's an 80% supply, everyone's going to have to take a 20% haircut here. But there are cases that dig deeper into this proportionate fair share concept. And the courts do historically evaluate these factors here. And this does get into, is it reasonable? Is there a best use? That gets a little bit dangerous because we're talking about, you know, the character of the soil. Should you really be farming if you're applying a whole bunch of water to poor soils? Is that a good idea? Should you get your same proportionate fair share compared to someone with a better soil profile? To me, that gets pretty dangerous and really obviously into the facts here. But these are the proportionate fair share evaluation characteristics that courts have used in the past. This is probably more important. In overlying rights than riparians, just because there's a huge, the vast quantity of extractions are really overlying water right holders. So we are talking about kind of the larger share of the demand. All right. So shortage for appropriators, it's the same concept in surface water, first in time, first in right. And again, a prior appropriator, if you can prove that you were appropriating before someone, you get to take all of your demand before anyone else behind you is supplied. And again, because these are not issued licenses, it's all about claims of when you began to appropriate. Shortage for prescriptive rights, it really depends on what right you prescribed. If you prescribed an overlying water right holder's right, you would have to go based on the correlative share that you prescribed. Again, very, very fact intense, very, very difficult to establish. And if you prescribed an appropriator, you would again step into that appropriator's shoes and take their first in time, first in right. So you would take their time. So if you were prescribing an appropriator's right and they had a 1920 extraction date, that again is the date that you would have for shortage. Non-use, and I'm gonna pause right here. I wanna plug in my phone. I don't want it to run out of batteries, and it just said low battery. So give me 1 second and I'll plug in. If anyone has any questions, definitely let me know and think about them now. But let me get this plugged in so I don't go dark on us here.
Yeah, Valerie, this is Bill Leip. I'm curious as to how evapotranspiration with growing of crops factors into how you determine whether one person is growing with the appropriate amount of water in the same crop, maybe grown in another area, requires more or less water. How does that get evaluated?
Whoops. Sorry, can you see me? Yeah, that is one of the evaluation components. If you have an ET that's very high, I mean, it's not wasteful, but for example, if you have a really high ET causing you to use twice as much water as a neighbor who's growing the same crops, it's very possible a court would take that into consideration and say, hey, listen, you're just not as efficient and we can't allow you the same 80% as your neighbor because you're not being efficient. You know, you're getting twice as much water to grow the same crop. So ET is something, sorry, I'm getting this, that the courts do consider. And it's, again, one of those efficiency issues of, are you being efficient? Is your soil profile correct? You know, should we be giving you twice as much water as your neighbor to grow the same crop? That's something a court would definitely consider. Okay, thanks, I'm plugged in. Sorry for the back and forth there. Okay, so non-use, similar to riparians, overlying water right holders are not subject to forfeiture for non-use. Now, in adjudications, this becomes a point of contention. I know that there are certain water practitioners that say that if you are an overlying water right holder and you've never used that right, when it comes to an adjudication, you could be what's called subordinated. And that means that even though you don't lose your right, an adjudication might not consider your demand if you've never had it before. But with that caveat kind of put to the side, similar to a riparian, if you've never used overlying, your overlying right, you could buy a parcel tomorrow and come on and start, sink a well and start pumping. And again, you cannot, but in common law, you cannot have that overlying water right extinguished because of prior non-use. This concept of subordination is an interesting one. It's a little bit political. The concept that you've never used it before, and so you should never use it again. People take kind of the flip side of that and say, well, if you've never used it, you've been helping the basin, and so you shouldn't be punished. So, sorry. Can you guys hear me still?
Yes, we can.
You're
Okay,
good.
Sorry. And I don't know if you can see me. Here we go. I apologize. And so the concept is, should we be punishing folks for non-use in an adjudication? And I think that from my perspective, and I don't know how popular it is, I think the common law rule of non-use should be respected. And in fact, if you've never used before, you're probably not causing the overdraft, and you shouldn't be punished for that prior non-use. But from a common law perspective, if you don't use an overlying water right, you don't lose it. Similar to the surface water appropriators, it's a use it or lose it. If you're a groundwater appropriator and you have 5 years of non-use, you are subject to forfeiture. So again, use it or lose it. And again, if you don't use that water, you could very easily be subject to prescription during a period of overdraft if other people are using water. Similarly, for prescriptive rights, you are also subject to non-use. So if you prescribed and did a great job establishing prescription and for 5 years in a period of adverse and hostile use, and then for some reason you don't use water for 5 years, you would be subject to a forfeiture claim. So, okay, so that those are kind of the big picture rules for groundwater. I have, I think, a couple more slides just based on SGMA and what SGMA means in the context of groundwater rights. And so I think I'll finish these slides and then take any questions folks have. So SGMA, I think hopefully everyone in this group knows generally what SGMA is at this point. It's not an adjudication. It's not a required physical solution. It's a planning requirement. So it's a requirement that agencies, local agencies come on and develop a plan to plan for sustainable groundwater use going forward. It does not, of course, establish any permitting system. Interestingly, it was adopted in 2014, exactly 100 years after the surface water system did adopt a specific permitting system. I know that that was a huge issue when SGMA was adopted. Do we do permits? Is it a statewide system? And it was specifically adopted to not have that and not be kind of a top-down system, but a locally controlled management-based regulation. So obviously, SGMA's purpose is to achieve sustainable groundwater management, and the way that SGMA defines that is the avoidance of undesirable results in 6 areas that you see there: groundwater storage, groundwater elevations, water quality, seawater intrusion, land subsidence, and depletions of interconnected water. So it's a planning document. It's not, or it's a planning regulation. It's not a required adjudication like a lot of folks think. And does it affect water rights? This is one of the lingering questions, and for those who don't know SGMA or who haven't been involved in it, it was one of the big issues out of the gates. SGMA tried to kind of bend over backwards, saying nothing in SGMA should affect groundwater rights. GSA does not have the authority to adjudicate the basin. It cannot determine whether you have a right or not, whether your right is valid or not. And basically the agency cannot make a binding determination of the water rights of any entity. So the does it affect water rights was taken off the table. However, for those folks who live in kind of the reality and are more operations focused, the question of whether either the state or a GSA can limit extractions is a different question than the water right question. And it really goes back to that first slide of your right may not be able to be taken, but you can be told that your extractions can be limited. And in certain circumstances, both GSAs and the State Water Board do have the authority to limit extractions. So they can't tell you that you don't have a right, but they can tell you when and how to use that right. So if you're just looking at it from a pure operations standpoint, you may say that seems strange. What's the difference? If you're looking at it from more of a legal practitioner point of view, you still have that right. If your basin were able to recharge and all this and have a huge amount of supply inflection, and you were always able to have plenty of supply, your right is still the same. You would still be able to extract. However, in practice, kind of the same answer about the fish regulation for surface water, GSAs and the state board do both have limited authority to tell you that you have to limit extractions. So, and then this is a little bit of an old slide, but it kind of explains when the State Water Board would be able to limit extractions. And of course, it's DWR that is managing compliance with SGMA, meaning does your plan provide enough data? Is it a sufficient or adequate plan? But it's the State Water Resources Control Board that has this backstop enforcement authority. So 3 ways that the State Water Board can come into your basin and act as an enforcement agency is that if you failed to develop a GSA by 2017, most people made it to the finish line on that, although some people kind of staggered in. If you do not develop a GSP by either the 2020 or 2022 deadlines, or if the determination is that your GSP is inadequate. So if you provide the DWR a plan and it determines that that plan's not adequate and you don't do anything to fix it, that is a trigger as well. And then of course there's the failure to implement trigger. And if you do not implement the components of your GSP, then that is another way that the State Water Board can come in and declare your basin probationary. And what happens when that happens is that the State Water Board will give you a probationary notice. You'll go to a probationary hearing at least 90 days after the notice. Reporting fees and requirements at this point are triggered. And these are, unlike the GSA authority, these are specific to well owners. So at that point, if you become probationary, the State Water Board kind of penetrates the GSA representation and it goes straight to well owners. You have 180 days to cure the problems that made you probationary if the State Water Board determines that you are probationary. And if you still don't do any of that, then the State Water Board will be able to develop an interim plan for your basin. And in that interim plan is where they would be able to limit extractions. So even though the State Water Board has the authority to do that, it's not right at their fingertips. They have to go through quite a bit of noticing, hearings, cure periods, and that kind of thing. So it's not right away, and no one has even been gone to a probationary hearing yet. So we're still pretty much in the early stages of this. But further down the road, if plans are deemed inadequate or people don't implement those plans, this would be this process by which the State Water Board could come in and eventually limit extractions. So that's a lot of information, and I realize it's kind of drinking through a fire hose here. But if folks have questions, I'm happy to take them. And if people want more information about SGMA, I'm happy to provide that too. That was just kind of a little tying SGMA into how the water rights system works and how it affects water rights or doesn't.
Okay, so I see 2 questions or 2 people with their hands up. Bill Light, please go ahead.
Thanks, Emily. Valerie, can you explain the difference between an adjudication and a groundwater sustainability plan? Because they both kind of seem to result in the same perhaps a very similar outcome. And so you said that in one of the slides that it's not Sigma is not an adjudication, but a groundwater sustainability plan is in effect a type of adjudication for a subbasin. Seems to me, at least.
Yeah, there are some fundamental differences. The main one being really is that if you go through an adjudication, one is obviously by the court. Let's start with that, the parties, right? So one is by the court, and it's started by a quiet title claim. So it's usually started by a landowner. That's an adjudication, and you go to the court and you say, hey, listen, court, we want you to determine who has what right in this basin. And we want you to develop a physical solution for how we can extract water. Who's in what priority, who has a valid right, who doesn't have a valid right. And so that's just between all landowners and appropriators and a court. A GSA obviously is, or several GSAs, depending on your basin, is the agency or the public entity that is doing a GSP. And a GSP is not going to tell you necessarily who has a valid right and who doesn't, and how much you can divert or extract. The whole point of GSP is to try to do some planning. So an adjudication is not going to tell you you can do a recharge project or not. It's going to say, hey, listen, you've pretty much got this general supply and you've got this demand. And here's what demand is valid. Here's what demand is not valid. And here's how you deal with shortage. So that's what an adjudication is. And I will tell you that usually there's not really any winners in an adjudication. I have seen a lot of people go in thinking that they're going to kind of come out of an adjudication really well suited. And a lot of times that the court tends to, split the baby. And most people aren't thrilled with that. Interestingly, even if you did an adjudication, the Sigma has decided that doesn't comply with Sigma. So if you came out and did an adjudication from a court, you would still have to engage in the planning GSP document. So you don't get out of having to plan. And a GSP isn't going to tell you whether you can or can't extract. It might tell you when you can't extract, but it's supposed to look at the 6 sustainability indicators and say, it looks like you're in trouble on groundwater elevations, so people need to either cut back or do recharge projects or do these other 10 projects. So it's supposed to kind of give you a plan to get to sustainability. Whereas in adjudication, the court's not looking to get you to sustainability. It's looking to stop people from fighting. And so it's gonna say, you either have a valid right or you don't, and here's your order of extraction priority. It's not gonna talk to you about recharge. It's not gonna talk to you about what interconnected surface water looks like. It's not gonna talk to you about seawater intrusion. It's not gonna tell you any of those components. And if you have that adjudication, you're probably, it would be in a perfect world, you would know who has a valid right and who doesn't. That would be helpful in implementing your GSP, but you'd still have to go in and do this GSP planning and evaluate all the components that an adjudication doesn't talk about. So I don't know if that's helpful, but in some ways they're the same because they're trying to get you to a position of stopping overdraft, but really that's kind of the only commonality that they have.
Okay, great. And so now we have Robin Lee. Please go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, I was wondering, there's been some cases where a river was actually given personhood, where when that was done, then groups could advocate for species within the river. So that's been done a couple times in the country. I wonder what you know about that. And I don't think it's been done in California. This is in other states. And it's been done also around the world. So it's kind of something that's kind of picking up steam, so to speak. And so I wonder if you've heard of this and if you know about the implications.
No, I haven't heard of that. If I heard you correctly, did you say personhood?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's given rights, so it can be advocated for.
Right, and that's I mean, it's been a hotbed issue in California, right? I mean, if any place California would seem to be able to give a right to, you know, the fishery, and it would make sense that DFW or a NGO of some sort could go to the water board and say, hey, listen, we want a license to keep water in the river. That isn't allowed, but I'll tell you from a water purveyor perspective, or folks who are people who divert water, the regulatory authority and that the state water board has in constantly changing the amount of water you're able to divert or extract may be even a more a stronger tool. And the reason for that strength is because you can limit the diversion and use of existing beneficial uses. Whereas if you allowed the fishery to apply for a right, frankly, they couldn't establish a pre-14 right. They could buy riparian land, I suppose, but again, that's to divert water out. And you kind of trump the priority system, right? I mean, if you allowed the fishery to be treated like a person and apply for a right, they'd be in the back of the line. Whereas allowing the state water board to regulate all existing water right holders really trumps that priority issue and puts them a lot of times in the front. So, I mean, that's my thinking on it. I haven't seen an example of what you're talking about. So, but I don't doubt that both NGOs and the state water board and DFW certainly are thinking of using all tools that they have in their tool chest to regulate water and preserve ecosystems and be cautious about that. Obviously, the public trust is a huge issue in the Mono Lake. You know, back in the 70s, that was kind of the original case of saying, hey, you know what, we over appropriated the stream here and we didn't really consider fishery or ecological benefits. We're going to have to kind of go back and reconsider those. And so the public trust doctrine does allow you to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, next we have Mike McCullough. Please go ahead, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah.
All right, so in the Carmel River, they have classified it as a known and defined channel. And so a lot of the extractions that occur over there fall under, I guess it would be surface water rights. If it's, you know, even though the extractions are underground, I guess they classify it as a surface water right.
That's right.
And then Salinas Valley, I think they haven't had that designation of a known and defined channel for the Salinas River.
That's right.
Obviously, there's a lot of extraction that goes along the river. I think that's pretty common knowledge. And so with the GSA, you know, moving in the, you know, trying to find plans for all these different basins that are in and around the Salinas River, you know, what do you think is the preferred method of trying to quantify whether it's either percolating groundwater, which you said is kind of, I would think, a wider acreage versus a more smaller, narrower Salinas River where there could be coordination between the surface water and the groundwater. So I know it's kind of a long-winded question, but I think it's kind of one of the underlying factors, I think, for, you know, the whole valley that, you know, has close proximity to the river.
Right. And I think, I mean, that is a tough question for a number of reasons. One is overcoming that assumption that if you're extracting water through a well, that it's percolating groundwater, you have the burden to prove that it's not. So you would have to go in and say, nope, it's not percolating groundwater. I'm going to go ahead and I want the court to declare that this is a known and defined channel, and that I'm really diverting surface water, not groundwater. So let's say hypothetically you did that, and you spent the time and technical costs and everything to do that. The outstanding issue really becomes, and there's not a lot of law on this in California, but my guess is it will become an area of law that is more developed, and that's the issue of common supply. And again, there are only a couple cases on this, but if you can prove that there's a common supply, meaning the surface water and groundwater really affect each other so much that if you take water from the surface water supply or the groundwater supply, it's really the exact same supply, then you kind of have to combine the systems, and you have to figure out priority amongst and between those systems. So it's rare. It's usually not the case that you can go and establish that. My guess is that would take close to a decade to even establish common supply. So the question is, if you want to be considered a surface water diverter rather than a groundwater extractor, what does that get you? And that question is very much unanswered and unclear. It probably means you're not directly regulated by the GSA if you're a surface water diverter, but there is that sustainability indicator of interconnected surface water supplies that could have a long arm and reach you, or you could be in a situation where if it's a true common supply, someone may have to start that process of proving that up and then treating the system as such. But those are really fraught with so much technical information and a court needing to decide that it is a process that would be very long and enduring, is my guess. So the first step would be that you have to overcome the presumption that it's percolating groundwater. And then from there, what does that get you? It might get you common supply and further litigation. It may get you, at least for a temporary period, outside of some GSA regulation, but I have a feeling that interconnected surface water component may drag you back in. So it's tough to know whether to invest in that kind of establishing that you really are a surface water diverter rather than a groundwater extractor.
Well, thank you for the good news.
Okay. Next we have Thomas Versick.
Thank you, Ms. Kincaid. It's actually just a couple of different comments that are triggered mostly by the last couple of questions. And I mean, I'm much more local to the Salinas Valley. My work is much more local to the Salinas Valley. So I have some, granular information. So I'm not disputing anything that you've presented. I think it's a good presentation, but a couple of things. One, there is, I think in the mid 60s, haven't looked at it in a while, a determination at the State Water Resources Control Board about the bed and banks of the Salinas River, I think south of the county line. But hydrogeologically, maybe, it's not quite so difficult to make the distinctions about the surface and groundwater, which gets to the other point, is that maybe a common supply is actually a good thing, not a bad thing, because then it would make the GSP much more comprehensive and would have more of a relationship with the operation of the reservoirs, which, at least in my opinion, and others, is absolutely necessary to have a reasonable GSP in this particular valley. And then on adjudication, what Mr. Leip said in your response, those are realities, but I would also add that in an adjudication, at least from my perspective, physical solutions are something courts and the parties always have the right to push. So if you push far enough, you really could end up with very much the same kind of tools and sets as GSPs. Not to say that's a good thing to do, but I do think it is actually possible. And I'm going to suggest an alternate phrasing about a GSP. A GSP doesn't have to be, but it can actually be the very localized granular determination of reasonable and beneficial use. Won't always be for every area and every GSP, but in certain situations, and probably in this valley, it may very well end up there. And so the regulation not regulation, the authority to limit extractions or to modify them or what have you, I think can be seen as highly localized, reasonable and beneficial use determinations. So I'm just adding some granular content, my own, not being authoritative except for my own clients, to what are broad, I would think are useful and broad and, as you said, high level perspectives on all this. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with anything you said. Certainly, these are the rules, and as they apply specifically to, like you said, the local granular facts on the ground, I certainly am not making comments about that, but it's going to be that is the very, very difficult work that these GSAs are going to have to do. The only point that I don't think I differ with you about, but it makes me nervous, is whether a GSA really has the authority or is the right agency to make calls about beneficial uses. That just, it's possible you could stretch it and say that. That makes me nervous just because we have so many clients that are GSAs, and if one of those clients came to me and said, hey, listen, we're thinking about saying, pistachio growing is definitely beneficial use, but row crops aren't anymore, I would bristle and tell them that is very concerning to me, just because I think I don't know if you could defend that kind of determination, and if you have the authority to do it as a GSA. My thought would be that you're on thin ice. But certainly the other information, I think that's true. And at the local level, you're going to have to feed all of the local nuances, all of the local facts about storage and whether it's surface water or groundwater into this larger construct of law. And I find that to be really exciting and interesting, but there's no doubt it's going to be a long, arduous process. So good for you guys to be in the driver's seat on that.
Okay, thank you. Now, next we have Horacio Amezquita. Go ahead, Horacio.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Valerie. I have a question. In 2012, California passed the Human Right to Water, and then it was adopted by the State Water Board, and then it was also adopted by Monterey County. And I was wondering if since the GSA is located in Monterey County, is the human right to water automatic passes to the GSA?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what the human right to water really means is not quite defined yet, but there have been a lot of GSPs and who have gotten a comment from folks about the fact that they didn't explicitly consider a human right to water. I think in large part the water quality components and the domestic considerations are what they're honing in on. And I certainly think that the State Water Board thought when they adopted the human right to water that it would at least lead somewhat in the direction of providing decent quality water, whether that's surface water or groundwater, to municipalities and local users. There is no specific component of SGMA that says what that exactly means, but you are required to consider it. I think it's a little bit of an overlap. I think if a really good GSP didn't even mention the human right to water, they should talk about domestic provision, specific communities getting and accessing continued decent quality, potable quality water supplies. So certainly the GSP is going to have to think about that. How exactly they provide for that is still undefined largely.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised, but does anybody have any other questions either from committee members or members of the public? Okay. Well, I don't see any other hands raised. Give it a few more seconds for any other last minute questions. Valerie, you did give us a ton of information. Thank you so much for that. Oh, there we go. One more question. Melissa Duflock, please go ahead.
Yes, how can we get a copy of your PowerPoint presentation?
If it's okay with you, Valerie, I can distribute on our website.
Sure, that's fine. Feel free to post it. And if folks have other questions that they think of afterwards or thoughts, feel free to reach out to Derek or myself. And like I said, the inputting of local facts to all of these rules are going to be the tough part. So.
Okay, Melissa, I'll send it to you directly and then I'll figure out a good place to post it as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, with that, I will thank you again, Valerie, for your presentation and
thank you.
A lot of information. And I don't have any additional, let's see, let me just check, confirm with the agenda. I don't have any additional staff updates. And so with that, the meeting will be adjourned.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.